Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this the clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today is a video where I am sure I am going to do nothing but annoy absolutely everyone with my takes on ethnicity, belonging, and what it means to be British, English, whichever one you want to do. In fact, I want to get that out of the way really early. I'm going to be using the terms British and English quite interchangeably, because effectively all British means is English expansionism. You know, when people, it's why a lot of Scots prefer to say they're Scottish rather than British, because to absolutely everyone, British basically does just mean English. I know I'm already going to annoy some people with that, but oh well. The uniting of the British Isles, along with Ireland, along with the Empire, largely a English project, just mostly administered by the Scots. Anyway, there was quite a bit of an uproar over on Twitter over the past couple of days after a Triggernometry episode released with an interview with Fraser Nelson. Now, for those of you who don't know Fraser Nelson, he was editor of The Spectator for some years, oversaw its massive rise in popularity over the past few years. From articles I've seen, he effectively allowed people to write whatever they wanted and defended them to the hilt. He saw his job as editor of The Spectator not to edit what people think, but simply to stop them breaking the law. He is obviously a supporter of the Tory party, and he is, I think everyone can agree, a bit of a Tory wet, where he is generally a supporter of, fiscal conservatism, if you want to put it that way, but he is a bit of a social liberal. And it ended up with him, well, exploding in this clip, where if anyone who knows Fraser Nelson will be completely unsurprised by this, but yeah, it annoyed quite a few people because part of the culture wars now is, well, defining what Englishness really means. And it is something that I can completely understand why it is in the public consciousness, because, let's be fair, we have been giving out British citizenship like confetti. And it's obviously a problem, but anyway, we'll get into the clip now.
The point you're making is entirely correct, which is Britain is very good at absorbing people from other places.
And better than most of the European countries. That's
I've made this point my entire public career.
This is just true, by the way. Via pretty much every poll, Britain is much more tolerant on racial lines, religious lines, other country lines, other nationality lines, than most of the, if not all of the European countries. It quite amazingly is just not in our character to be bigoted, and as I'll go through, this dates back way into the 19th century, possibly even back to the 18th. But the question, however, does come in. What makes a person a part of a specific peoples? And as I'll go into, they start talking about Rishi Sunak. Is he Indian or is he English? And the answer is, well, it depends what you mean.
The reason people feel strongly about immigration is they see the numbers that we have had over the last 2 decades. They naturally, people will, I think quite reasonably, project that into the future for the reason that Francis gave, which is, it doesn't matter what politicians say, they're not dealing with this issue.
Yeah, everyone just instinctively knows, and it is just common sense. You can't have that many people coming into the country and see successful integration. It's just impossible. It's not going to happen. However, as evidenced by the popularity of the England team over the past few years, the past few cups, despite Gareth Southgate fumbling the bag every time, people are quite happy, clearly, to accept that, well, you can have black English people, sorry, they represent the English team, which is where my point comes in, that clearly integration can happen, you can be one with the English via integration, and an awful lot of the English seem to agree. And again, this is where it will all come down to definitions, but I suppose we'll have to wait for that. Yes, you're going to have to dwell on me saying, yes, you can actually be English and black, and call me cringe if you want to, but I'll get to the point when it comes to it.
That means, are we going to have millions and millions and millions and millions more people coming? And then they go, what is the impact of that scale? It's not about immigrants and our willingness to welcome them. It's about the scale. What is the impact on our infrastructure? What is the impact on societal cohesion?
You bet.
Yeah, it's quite a funny thing. The main reason Fraser Nelson's being interviewed here is because he is quite a defender of multicultural Britain. He effectively calls it a success story. The thing with Fraser Nelson is that because he worked at The Spectator and now he works as a columnist for The Telegraph full time, when he goes into any of the offices, he hired a, I believe, Chinese immigrant to be the head of podcasts at The Spectator. Living in London and working in London, I have no doubt that he sees many people of many different backgrounds working together very cordially, having basically no issues with each other, and this is Fraser Nelson's effectively vision for Britain. The problem is that not everywhere in Britain is like that. In fact, it's probably quite rare in Britain that you have places like where Fraser Nelson works, where everyone comes together, understands what Britishness or Englishness in terms of civic values are, and works together for that. There's plenty of places throughout Britain where English civil values are just rejected, effectively. And this is people's main problem. It's rather a large problem between, well, frankly, working class or left behind areas and affluent middle to upper class areas. It's absolutely an issue, and this is why there's a lot of talking past each other, because there is definitely a class divide when it comes to experiences with immigration. And it's why, in droves, people have been voting for less immigration basically forever. There has basically never been a time where more immigration was a winning manifesto commitment. In fact, I'd probably go as far as to say there never has been, or at least one that I can think of off the top of my head. Because people instinctively understand that it's actually quite difficult to integrate, and it is nigh on impossible to integrate if you form literal colonies throughout England, well, and the rest of Britain, frankly.
What is the... Look, this is something that no one wants to talk about, especially in these kind of places, but I, as an immigrant, can say it.
This is another thing that really annoys people, but it's just frankly true. If you are English and you say this stuff, you do just get dismissed as racist. However, if an actual immigrant says it, you know, we kind of need to use them because of the situation we find ourselves in, unfortunately. I like Konstantin Kisin. I like his point on this. I think he's correct.
What percentage of the native population does England cease to be England?
It's a very good question. I think it's a question that Fraser Nelson is going to struggle to answer because, again, it depends what you mean by the question. When does England cease to be English? Well, ethnically, I suppose it's when less than half the country have native English ancestry. From a civics perspective, I would argue it's quite a bit different.
Is it 50%? Is it 40%? Is it 10%? When there are no English people left, is it still England? Right? That is a thing that no one wants to talk about, but I know millions of people subtly feel, and not just English or British people, my relatives from Russia or Ukraine or Armenia or whatever, they come to Heathrow and they go, is this still England?
Yeah, this was a massive issue with the Ukrainian refugees. Because England and Britain are a bit of a weird place, we definitely put less of an emphasis on genetic makeup, heritage, ancestry than other places in Europe and the world. I wouldn't say we're the least. I'd say America probably has the least emphasis on it. It just so happens to be a place in the Anglosphere, I will say that. And this is certainly the problem we're having today. We have let in an awful lot of people who have gone as far as to seem English civilly and then will do everything in their power to actually effectively undermine England as a nation as it is now anyway. The thing that I would refute this, I would not say that this is necessarily foreign interference. This has been an issue that Britain has had throughout the 20th century as leftist intelligentsia has got more and more power. You read any George Orwell, you will know that the leftist intelligentsia has been an issue for over a century. Over a century. And they hate Britain, and I'm with David Starkey on this, because Britain has never been, or England, has never been a left-wing country, and that's why they want it destroyed, because it is instinctively, frankly, anti-left-wing. And it's taken a century of gaslighting to get us to a place where normies will say the NHS is the best thing England ever did, or Britain ever did, despite the fact that there are clearly better achievements out there than a lacklustre healthcare system. It's taken a century to subvert us, and a lot of people don't seem to like me saying it, but an awful lot of it has come from our own homegrown native stock. There are just people who are first or second generation immigrants who are riding that wave because it benefits them. And they will subvert classic English and British ideals to, well, defend ridiculous positions, like Fraser Nelson is doing, who again is part of the native British stock. He's Scottish after all.
Right? Now, you could say that shows the success of our society. There's a hell of a lot of people who don't agree with you.
That's right. I mean, do we regard Rishi Sunak as English, for example?
I've always said, this is a very unpopular thing, that I'm not English. I will never be English. I don't think Rishi Sunak is English. We're both British.
This is where the interchangeableness of British and English it does get quite annoying. But I really do think they are largely interchangeable, because British ideals are basically just English ideals. It's just British is very much largely a civic idea, though to a lot of people as well, because English words have a lot of different meanings sometimes. It also effectively means the, super ethnic category, if you will, of Scottish, English, Welsh and Irish. And to translate this and make it absolutely clear and steelman it, what Konstantin has said here is that they have no no English heritage, British as well. Konstantin Kisin is a Russian Jew. He is not English. He understands that on a genetic level. Rishi Sunak doesn't have any English ancestry. He is Indian by genetics. However, Fraser Nelson is going to say something that, annoyed a lot of people, but honestly, I know where he's coming from.
Well, we're not English.
No, you weren't born here. You were an immigrant.
No, well, my son was born here. I don't think my son is English.
As far as I can find, Konstantin's wife isn't English either, in terms of ancestry, blood, genetics, whatever. Again, he is correct. Purely in terms of blood, heritage, whatever, his son is not English. It's perfectly fine to say. The reason that Fraser Nelson keeps giving these looks of confusion is because he really doesn't care about genetics at all. He has gone fully down a lot of people call it civic nationalist route, and I would largely agree, that genetics don't matter at all. Now, there's barely anyone alive who actually genuinely thinks that, and push comes to shove, Fraser probably would understand what he says, but he's so fixated on English and Britishness being all about values, ideals and habits that he really does just want to reject this whole idea of genetics being at all relevant, which not even I would agree with. I think genetics are relevant to some level, but we'll get into it after he makes his argument about Rishi Sunak.
A Russian
Again, that's
Ukrainian
definition,
immigrant.
right? I would say that Rishi Sunak is as English as Tizer and Y-Front, right?
To my American audience, Tizer's just a soft drink in the UK. It's a bit like George Orwell's suet pudding and horse racing. They're English staples, that's all you need to know. But, he's probably, to some extent I want to make it clear, correct. Rishi Sunak could not have been born and raised anywhere else. He really couldn't. He has a lot of habits, he holds a lot of values that you could only have growing up in Britain. And a lot of people have an issue of, why is English values always these universal liberal values? Answer, well, because they are the British values. The thing is that we owned a quarter of the world, therefore it's been exported everywhere, therefore they're seen as universal. And a lot of people ask, well, what's largely the difference between this and France's values and German values? And, well, German we do have quite a few different values too, because, my God, if you saw that 60 Minutes clip of German, I think they were lawmakers, I'm not sure, but some Germans completely defending hate speech laws and just saying, we send fines to people who insult on the internet. Whereas that's seen as, well, quite gross to a lot of English people. However, they also defend sending some people to jail over Facebook posts. However, it does take actual physical violence for them to get to that point, which is where I'd say the difference is. But the problem is that, well, France and Britain, they're neighbouring countries effectively, they share a fair bit of philosophy. The main difference between them is how they actually interpret and enact that philosophy. So the values are obviously going to be quite similar, but just because they're similar doesn't mean they're not also dripping with their own uniqueness. And as I say, mainly it's the way it's interpreted and applied. France are quite a bit more revolutionary about the way that they interpret their philosophy. Britain, England, what have you, they're quite a bit less about that. More reformist, take your time, let's not do anything too rash. There's a reason that Oliver Cromwell was dug up and executed posthumously. It's because he's one of the most hated men in Britain, because he was a violent revolutionary. Again, England, I should say there. This is the problem with the interchangeableness of it again. I say Britain, Only people that really know the difference between the Act of Union in 1705 know why that's wrong. But anyway, back to the point. Fraser is quite right to put forward, right, let me explain what I mean by England then. Because English, British, they mean a number of different things. And my main thesis of this is that people largely talk past each other when it comes to these definitions. And I think I have quite a unique outlook on what ethnicity actually is. Because by and large, it doesn't have a strict set of rules. The rules are effectively determined for ethnicity by that very ethnic group, so it is quite subjective, but we'll get into it.
He is absolutely English. He was born and bred here. And I wouldn't say that the colour of his skin makes him any
He's
less.
a brown Hindu. How is he English?
Fraser didn't do a particularly good job of explaining what he means, and it's because I don't think he's been well challenged on it before. Again, as I said at the start of the video, a way that Britain has shown to be very, very tolerant is effectively by allowing people with outside heritage to become English and British, and I do include English in that. A question I keep asking ethnonats is, was Disraeli British, or sometimes I say English. Again, I use them interchangeably. And an awful lot of them say, oh no, he was a Sephardic Jew, because, you know, his grandfather came from Italy, who moved there from the Iberian Peninsula, and then his son, I think his grandfather was called Benjamin actually, but his son then, when he was in England, integrated quite well, baptised all his kids to be Anglicans, and Disraeli eventually decided, oh, I'm going to drop the apostrophe Israeli and just call myself Disraeli to anglicise it. And by and large, the reason Disraeli became prominent is because effectively he was called a Jew by an Irish MP, and he took massive insult to that, challenged him to a duel. The Irish MP backed out of it, and he became prominent from, well, this drama, effectively, because a lot of people saw, oh, he's willing effectively to denounce his own physical heritage, his ancestry, to be part of us. Well, we're happy for him to be part of us, and he became one of the greatest statesmen of all time, getting voted in as an MP an awful lot of the time, and then becoming PM twice, I want to say. Might have been once, can't remember. And generally people saw him as a great British statesman and saw him as English, British, whichever one you want to pick. And that is a great integration success story. And there's been numerous people who have come over and, you know, become part of the English stock. Huguenots, another example. French Protestants. They were kicked out of the country due to religious persecution. They came to Britain where there was a bit more tolerance for Protestants. And, well, what's a Huguenot now? They don't exist, really. Why? Well, because as a group they integrated. And on an individual level, it's much easier to integrate than as a group. As a small group that came over 200 years, much easier than millions of people coming over in a 10-year time span. There's levels to this, clearly. And from Fraser Nelson's perspective, despite Rishi Sunak being a brown Hindu, it's kind of hard to say that he was brought up Indian. He absolutely does still have some Indian habits. He's a Hindu, for example. That's fine to say. However, you know, Britain is rather tolerant on that. You know, a Jew's British. Well, Disraeli was. A Catholic's British. Well, they were emancipated. However, we're clearly getting to a point where this emancipation is getting too far. We've gone through a revolution, thanks to Blair and an awful lot of the Fabians, and people aren't liking it, but they've not noticed it because it wasn't violent. However, this is why we're having a culture war at the moment. We are literally trying to define British values, English values, and who should be deemed English and British. And I don't think Fraser Nelson's entirely wrong, and I know that's probably going to annoy some people, but I don't think he is, because he's talking specifically about Rishi Sunak's habits, his values, his way of being. And saying that genetics have nothing to do with it, again, I think it's too far. For instance, why does Jihadi John deserve to come back to Britain, but Shamima Begum not? Frankly, it's entirely down to heritage and genetics, so clearly there is a place for it, it's just not emphasised anywhere near to the degree that people's habits and character are. Again, I'll get into it in more detail a little bit later, but the way I see ethnicity, as I said before, it's defined by the ethnic group. So, to be English, effectively all that matters is two things. One, do you self-identify as English? Two, does the English as the larger ethnic group accept you as being English. If both those conditions are true, as far as I care, you are ethnically English. And I know a lot of people go up in arms about that, but that's because, again, ethnicity has a few different meanings to it. A meaning that a lot of people really focus on when it comes to ethnicity, you know, they'll say black, white, etc., etc. Well, that's race, and it's just a nicer way of putting race so that it doesn't, frankly, invoke race science. But it can also mean heritage, and that's fine if you mean heritage as ethnicity, but this is where the problem comes in, and it is a large problem that we're having at the moment. We're all having arguments about definitions. Largely, I think everyone can agree. Even Fraser Nelson will say, yeah, of course, again, even I'm doing it. In terms of his heritage and ancestry, Rishi Sunak is Indian. He'll agree to that. He's not saying it here because he's putting absolutely no emphasis on it, because according to Fraser Nelson, and a lot of other people, frankly, Rishi Sunak invokes enough of the English spirit, for lack of a better word, to be considered English or British. That's how a lot of people see it, and if that annoys you, take it up with the British public.
Because he's born and bred here.
So by being born here, you become English, in your opinion?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is where Fraser loses me. That's obviously absurd. You know, was George Orwell Indian? Of course he wasn't. Was Rudyard Kipling Indian? Of course he wasn't. Big question. Why? Because they were both born in British, English, whatever, colonies. What's the big issue we're having in Britain right now? Well, there are colonies all about. Where there are entire households where they won't speak a word of English. Despite the children being born there and going to English school and, you know, picking up English at school, could they be considered English? Well, I think that would be quite difficult. I think there's only so much school can do. You need frankly, I hate using the word, don't know why, but you need a holistic upbringing, an English holistic upbringing to really be considered English. And, well, was Rishi Sunak given that? Well, frankly, it would be difficult with two English parents, but given the way he presents himself, given the general values he has, given his habits, you know, yeah, it's good enough for most people. As I say, does he consider himself English? He seems to. Do the English consider him English now that he's self-identified as it? Generally they seem to. Good enough for me. Being born here has nothing to do with that, and anyone that tries to use that argument on me, it's just not going to work. And I suppose this is the other thing, and it's the thing that I guess Fraser worries about. There is clearly a cohort of people that want nationality to largely, or sometimes solely, be based on heritage and ancestry. Okay, that's their opinion. I think they're wrong, and I don't think it's going to make for a particularly useful or just England, but, you know, it's their opinion, and frankly, you need decent arguments against them, otherwise they're just going to grow. However, the comment Fraser's just said as well, going fully Civnat, having full-on anchor baby brain, that's got to be argued against as well, because all that's going to do is cause issues as well, and not make for a particularly just and fair Britain. And so I see it as my job to find the, well, sensible middle ground, to be the sensible centrist, if you will. And another issue with this is that this is exactly the type of argument that is used to justify mass immigration. Oh, if they're born here, magic soil, they'll be English. It's nonsense. It's not going to work. You know, there's not very many people that are going to be considering Axel Rudakubana or his family as English after what he did. Why? Well, there's a reason we jail our murderers here, especially if they kill kids. It's because we don't deem them as part of society. And if you do that, plus you're foreign, it's a recipe for deportation. And this is the thing, what defines that with Axel Rudakubana? Well, his heritage, genetics, DNA, whatever you want to call it. Again, how do we get to that point of the conversation? Well, we look at his habits. He's a mentalist. Good enough.
English, because there's a difference, right?
I don't think English is national. Look, to take, I'm a Scottish, right?
Yeah.
Now, are my kids English? I would say they are.
And I have absolutely no doubt that his kids would say they're English too. They were born in England, they grew up in England, and this is the problem with interchangeability with British. I mean, it was quite funny actually. Callum, the ex-Lotus Eater, he made a tweet and he called Fraser Nelson English, and I had to point out to him, I get your point, but he's Scottish. And it is quite funny. Why was it easy to confuse him? Well, frankly, it's because he's white, and it's because he has a posh Scottish accent that can frankly be confused with a decent English accent. It would be much harder to confuse Rishi Sunak, say, Skin colour and heritage, frankly. It's clearly relevant to some degree. But the English have been very good, and as I say, the reason I like using Disraeli is because that's an example that's over 100 years old. Clearly, there is some tradition of Britain, frankly, being quite civic nationalist. And don't get me wrong, clearly his example from the Irish MP, there were clearly some people that would not have accepted him as being part of the British or English group because of his ethnicity and heritage. Like, clearly there is a through line of people with this philosophy through England. So I'm not saying it's unfair or un-British necessarily to have this opinion. There's always going to be dissent. It's fine. But when it comes to majority opinion, which, as I went through before, is all that really matters when it comes to defining someone as being part of the group, whether you call it the nation, whether you call it the city, whether you even call it the ethnicity, if they self-identify and that group accepts that self-identification, they are part of that group. Is Rishi Sunak English? By that definition, yeah. By the definition of his heritage and ancestry, no. It's fine. But we need to get clear on those definitions. And Fraser Nelson has to really come up with better defences for the scale of immigration that we've had, because it's pretty damn close to indefensible. I'd say it's completely indefensible, but my God, you got to understand from Fraser Nelson's perspective, he's mostly only seen positives. He kind of just ignores the negatives, whether it's because he doesn't hear about it enough, whether it's because he doesn't believe people are being honest about the other side of the debate and they're being hyperbolic, I don't know. But he's going to need a damn better argument because he's losing it here.
How?
Because they were born here.
They're Scottish.
Yeah, this is really where the crux of the issue comes in. They're talking past each other. Fraser Nelson did a horrible job of defining what he meant. And the problem with that is because he's not thought about it deeply enough, I imagine. If you start saying they're born here, you're lost. You've ruined it. Your argument doesn't make sense. If he is defending it based on their place of birth, he has to defend that George Orwell was English, and absolutely nobody with a brain would do that. Because George Orwell never self-identified as Indian. Ever. Therefore, he can't ethnically be Indian. Obviously, with his heritage, born to two English parents, can't be Indian that way either. The idea that you are born somewhere, and therefore you are of that place, radically new idea, one that has basically been rejected throughout time. Doesn't work. And this is what's completely confusing Konstantin Kisin, because he understands that. He completely gets it. However, he is making the conversation all about heritage and ancestry, and Fraser Nelson, it's so alien to him to talk about that he's just talking past it. And it makes for a really interesting clip.
Nope.
By blood?
No,
right?
they've hardly ever been to Scotland, unfortunately.
So what?
By blood, so give me this.
Do you see what I mean? It's uncouth to Fraser Nelson to talk about blood and heritage. And it's because living in London, you are going to feel that way. Because like it or not, especially in the areas of London that he lives, obviously Tower Hamlets, basically is it Bangladeshi? I think it's like a Bangladeshi colony, I can't remember. You know, there's a reason that they came out in riots when there was a scandal over in Bangladesh. Why are they doing that in England? It's nothing to do with us. Oh, because they're Bangladeshi. But a lot of them probably were born in Britain. They probably barely ever went to Bangladesh, but they still consider it home. Why? Well, because the way they've been brought up, the stories they've been told by their parents, myths in some way as well, and they connect much more to that than England, because they've, you know, at best they've gone to an English school, sure, but that English school probably again was full of Bangladeshis. So their contact with the people of England, whether that even be integrated Indians like Rishi Sunak, is very, very limited. And so that's why they don't see it that way. George Orwell, he had contact with the Indians, sure, but it was mainly as an officer in the army. I've not read it myself, but he has a memoir on shooting a rampaging elephant in India, and he clearly considers himself different, at least from commentary I've heard on the memoir. He clearly sees himself as distinct from the Indians that he is, well, enforcing English rules on, frankly. But this is the problem. A lot of people do care, to some extent, about heritage. And it has to be asked for Fraser Nelson. Were we right to get rid of Shamima Begum's citizenship? If not, mental position, genuinely mental. But what's the real what's the real argument between Jihadi John being able to come back and being put in jail and Shamima Begum never being able to come back and put in jail? Answer: entirely due to heritage, genetics, ancestry, whichever one you want to go down. And it's good that Konstantin is hyper-focusing on this, because frankly, you know, libs need to address this issue. It's a real thing. Okay, yeah, you're absolutely right. Britain, England, we don't put much emphasis on it, but there's still some emphasis on it, clearly. And you need to address this point. You need a distinction between what are your civic nationalist values and can you incorporate any sort of ethnic values in there. And again, if you can't incorporate any of the ethnic values, well, clearly to a lot of people, when it comes down to it, basically, if you are a criminal, they'll look at your ethnicity and say, right, get deported. That will absolutely come into it. There's just no way around it. But obviously, Fraser Nelson's right. We have this habit of looking at people, as their values, as their habits, before anything else. And that's fine too. And I think going against that is, you know, not necessarily ahistoric, because there were prominent people in England and Britain who did think that way, but frankly their argument's lost. But there's a reason they're coming back with a vengeance, and it's because the libs have gone too far. Pure civic nationalism to the point where you're born is the only thing that matters doesn't work. You need to come up with better arguments, and, well, that's my job. And I think I've done a pretty good job.
I mean,
my son is born to a Russian and a Ukrainian, right? How on earth is he English?
Because he was born here.
It is pretty amazing at this point that it is just the NPC reply, but he was born here, don't you know? Yes, I do understand that. We're talking about genetics. Genetically, he's not English. Fraser will probably agree, but he doesn't want to get on it because he finds the entire discussion uncouth. Doesn't want to have it. So he just shuts it down. And it's not a great approach to the conversation.
So if your children had been born in Japan, would they be Japanese?
If they were born there, look, you get white Caribbean people, for example.
Hold on.
Yeah, that's true. One of my friends' dad is from Trinidad. Had a bit of an accent that wasn't entirely English or Scottish. I think he even had some Spanish ancestry as well. But hey, he came over to Britain, integrated pretty well. Why was that? Probably because he married a Scottish woman. But again, Fraser didn't say yes, and I think it's important to note that. He's kind of he seems to semi-understand that his point of being born somewhere doesn't make you of it. There's a bit more to it than that. Why was it easy for them to be born to Scottish parents but be English? Well, proximity, a shared sense of cultural values between Scots and English. Well, we're all British at the end of the day. It would be an interesting question, actually. On special occasions, does his son wear kilts, assuming he has a son? Do his daughters wear tartan at all? Because they would be signifiers of being Scottish rather than English. And over time, you're always going to get developing changes within a culture, and some of them are inherited from other cultures. In some ways, we give some of our ideas to other cultures as well, and they pick it up. Why does an awful lot of our ex-colonies have English-style parliaments? Because we were there. Does that mean Botswana has a Botswanan parliament? Yeah, but it's inherited from the English. So it's an English-style parliament, but it is Botswana's parliament. What makes it distinctly Botswanan? I have literally no idea. I don't know how the Botswanan parliament works. However, I would argue that because it's a parliament voted on by Botswanans, that probably makes it quite Botswanan. But it uses ideas developed by the English, and they were inherited by them. What's the point I'm trying to make here? What makes a ethnicity, a country, nation, whatever, whichever word you want to use, what makes their values and civic identity unique isn't necessarily that they share some of those values and habits with other countries. It is the unique mixture and hierarchy of these values and habits. Why is queuing seen as such a British thing? Because it is natural in the Brit to spontaneously form an orderly queue. Why is that? I have literally no idea. I don't know the history of queuing. I just know it's uniquely English. It's not something you typically see in, say, India, Africa. Now, do the Germans form orderly queues? Yeah, I've seen Germans form queues. Does that mean that the queue is no longer uniquely English? I suppose it could damage the uniqueness of it slightly. However, it doesn't stop it being British or an English habit. And a lot of people have been seeing videos on Twitter of, you know, people getting on a bus in London, and clearly they are, frankly, a bunch of foreigners. And people feel a deep sense of shame that, oh, it's got to a point where queuing at a bus stop just isn't normal to people. How's that happened? Well, they've not integrated properly. You know, does that mean if you queue properly you're integrated? Not necessarily. However, not queuing is a very good signifier that you've not integrated. It's a lot of complicated things all put into one to make someone integrated. And that is the thing that Fraser Nelson is also trying to avoid. He thinks if you're born here, you're of this place. No one agrees, I'm afraid, or barely anyone agrees. The only people that agree, as I say, liberal elites who practically the rest of the country are rejecting. Hence, we're in the middle of a culture war. What's this culture war about? Deciding what it means to be British. That is one of the core aspects of this culture war. And frankly, it looks like people like me, slowly but surely, are winning.
Just the Japanese example. Would they be Japanese?
If they were born there and lived their life there, then yeah.
Very, very liberal way to look at it. The important question is, would the Japanese agree? I don't particularly know. From what I hear from the ethnic nationalist side, they wouldn't. From the civic nationalist side, I don't hear an awful lot. I don't know. But I will say this. I don't particularly know any Japanese person on the international stage that doesn't have Japanese ancestry. Another thing I do know is that there's a big harumph about Assassin's Creed Shadows having to, frankly, dumb down their black samurai because an awful lot of Japanese people got mad and said this isn't really Japanese. What do we take from this? Well, what I take from it is that the Japanese people have a different definition of how someone becomes Japanese to how the English see how someone become English. As I say, comes down to how the group generally define if someone who self-identifies as said group can join said group. If someone says, oh, I inhibit Japanese values and I believe in Shinto or whatever, if the Japanese say, no, sorry, not enough ancestry, you're not Japanese, I'm afraid. Them's the rules. And the ethno-nuts can want a situation like that, and they can advocate that. You know, you're free to do that. I disagree. From polling almost throughout history, really, I don't want to go that far, at least for the past century, people have largely been on the side that I've been saying this episode. Heritage and DNA and ancestry, they're quite low down on the list of things that make you British. They are there, though. There is no denying that. But Fraser Nelson obviously completely rejects that. But Konstantin Kisin clearly acknowledges that the underlying small but still there idea that if you attain no British values, if you have completely different habits to the average Englishman, but at the end of the day you only have English ancestry, you're still English. So it is there. It's a point I always used to make in a quite funny way, and I never really believed this. But if we are able to deport Ash Sarkar, why shouldn't we be able to deport Owen Jones if you're going on a purely CivNat route, if you will? Answer, Owen Jones doesn't have anywhere else to go. Now, Ash Sarkar, when push comes to shove, she might say she doesn't have anywhere else to go, but the amount she said she's not British and the amount she said she's Bengali, I mean, that gives us a pretty good indication of where we can send her. Now, don't get any ideas. There is absolutely no way we are deporting Ash Sarkar. It's just not going to happen. However, I think it is a decent hypothetical to go through. And that's pretty much always been my position. If we are going to deport Ash Sarkar, why? Well, yeah, it's because of the ethnicity at the end of the day. It is there. Owen Jones doesn't get deported despite having all the same opinions as Ash Sarkar. Why? Nowhere else to go. Considers himself English. That's the end of it.
I think
the imperial identity I get, and I've said this, right? People should be able to come to this country and they buy into the imperial overarching identities. Exactly. We're all British.
Interesting he calls it imperial. I don't think I have an issue with that. I just call it civic rather than imperial. I don't know. I guess it's because of the negative connotations of imperial. But he's finally got to the core of the issue. We're talking about definitions, and he's probably now going to say, okay, but I'm talking specifically about blood, and he scoffs, obviously, before talking about blood and heritage and all that, but at the end of the day, it does matter. Might not necessarily matter much to the English, but at the end of the day, a lot of people's issues do come down to, I don't like these foreigners being here because they're acting foreign. If they were acting British and living by the laws of the land and the habits of the land, there really wouldn't be much issue, but that's not what's happening. And that's also something that, frankly, Fraser Nelson seems to avoid addressing.
That's fine with me. But pretending that my son is English, what? Come on.
Again, he's tripped up at the last hurdle then. He needs to be specific because the term English, it's up in the air. You know, I agree my son's English in terms of the Imperial project. However, come on, he's not English. It's like, hang on, you've just kind of said he is. Again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I am using it interchangeably with British. But yeah, genetically he's not at all. It's fine. But you need to make that clear when talking to Fraser Nelson, and he didn't here for some reason.
It depends if you think English has got an ethnic undertone. Now,
Yeah, of course it does.
Well, I disagree.
Yeah, well, this is where the libs fall down. It does have an ethnic undertone. Again, what does he mean by ethnic? Genetic, heritage, whatever. It does have that undertone. It's there. Of course it's there. However, it's not the be-all and end-all. Just because you have no British blood or English blood doesn't mean you can't be part of the group. What's my knockout punch for that? Disraeli.
I would say Hamza Yusuf, for example, is Scottish.
Yeah, I'm the kissing face here is very much an appropriate one, and honestly, possibly could be a tough question. It really could. But how is a man who denigrates the large racial makeup of Scotland, constantly denigrates Scotland being a racist country and what have you, how can he be considered Scottish? Well, if you ask the average Scotsman, they probably don't even know who he is. How disconnected normies are from politics is absolutely ridiculous. They will probably know what's going on in Westminster at a push. Your average Scotsman probably doesn't know what's going on in the Scottish Parliament, and I do mean that. But people, you know, political junkies who know about what he said and know about his history, they'd have... I have trouble agreeing with it. He seems to be much more worried about what's going on in Pakistan and Palestine than what's going on in Scotland. When he does work for Scotland, he seems to screw everything up. When he's making speeches, he seems to denigrate Scotland, apart from when people are having a go at him, saying he's not Scottish, and he'll say, of course I'm Scottish. And he does have a Scottish accent as well, which does indicate to some level of integration. Is it fully integrated? Of course it isn't. But that's what I mean. There's different aspects to this. Integration is a mixture of an awful lot of things coming together to the point where you are indistinguishable from, well, the average Scot, from the group. I'll go into my ideas on integration properly a little bit later, but I'm totally with Kisin here. It's a difficult question to ask. It feels like you kind of have to say Scottish because if you don't, you'll be called racist. Why? Oh, it's obviously because he's brown. And I would say, well, not really. As I said before, how can you say someone who denigrates Scotland for their native racial makeup, call them all racist when it's clearly not true, talk like you're an outsider to Scotland an awful lot of the time, and call yourself Scottish? It's quite difficult. And I made a video on this quite a while ago with David Lammy as well, calling it having your ethnicity and eating it too, where they will say they are both Scottish and Pakistani or Afro-Caribbean, depending on the person, and they will 180 on their attitude toward the country, depending which way they're coming from. David Lammy, for example, slavery reparations. He probably expects some because he's Afro-Caribbean. Well, if you're British, you owe it as well. But he's not on that side. So how can you call him integrated? It's quite difficult. You know, and there's of course bars for this, and there's of course an easier time for a Scotsman to integrate as an Englishman, obviously. It's going to be easier for a Frenchman to become an Englishman, obviously, than, say, an African who's from, I don't know, the Ivory Coast that was a French colony. And this is something that the libs just won't agree with because they believe in the blank slate. And Fraser Nelson is showing that he has some sort of blank slatism in his philosophy. And it's total nonsense. Barely anybody believes that, apart from, as George Orwell says, the intelligentsia. There's something so stupid only an intellectual could believe it. Blank slatism is one of them. And this is what, even on both the civic and heritage front, Konstantin Kisin has an issue with. Konstantin Kisin, I don't think he'd call himself English, and I think he'd appreciate that. And, you know, as far as I'm aware, he's not tried to go for British citizenship. I think it would be horrendously hypocritical of him to go for it after saying everything he had here, unless he's feels like he's properly integrated. But Fraser Nelson will probably be here saying, oh, well, you know, you seem pretty British to me. Why don't you go for it? Because he believes in blank slatism. But clearly Kisin understands that due to his heritage and habits he likely picked up from when he wasn't living in England, he can't really consider himself English or British. It's fair enough. I think it's a good outlook to have. And he's not committing any crimes. He's happy to stay here and not cause any trouble, and largely that's what the British people want from immigrants. Either people who are coming over to fully integrate, or if they're not coming here to integrate, be few and far between, and actually not push against British interests, let's say. Frankly, what are Sums of Yusuf done? The opposite of that.
Right, so look, you might disagree with me. People have different definitions of this, but in my opinion, if you're born in a country, you are of that country.
He's repeated that over and over and over, and I know it's a NPC line, but there's so many knockout punches to this point. Was George Orwell Indian? You've just got to get him to answer that.
I can look at my sons of half Scottish, half Slavic blood, right? If you were to do one of these Ancestry.com tests, they might say that. But in what meaningful sense are they half Czech, really?
This is the point where he, as I've said before, he has no interest in talking about heritage or blood. He doesn't. Heritage, again, even heritage is kind of, that's got a civic aspect to it. I suppose I've been using the wrong word this whole time. Genetic component. He puts no emphasis on it, which I think is fine. I don't put much emphasis on genetics, really. I mean, I've sent out for my DNA test, and I should be getting it back next month, and trust me, I'm doing a video on it. But if I find out I have, like, you know, Norwegian blood or something, I'm not all of a sudden going to become a plastic Norwegian Scandi or anything like that. I'll just be like, oh, that's interesting. You know, one of my ancestors must have been quite a slow runner. And it's something that a lot of Americans they don't seem to understand at all. It's really funny, but whenever I've been in Ireland, taxi driver, whenever the conversation gets onto Americans, plastic paddies always come up. The Irish hate them. They will, you know, the Americans will say, oh, I had a granddaddy who was from Cork, something like that, and the taxi driver will be like, Jesus, not again. Because, frankly, they are, the Irish, Scottish, whatever, they are fed up with their, with their entire sense of being put down to, oh, great, it's all come down to a grandfather spunking in a woman. That's what it's come down to. It's not to do with Irish jigs, their myths, their ancestors, as I say, what they actually did. It's all down to, yeah, it's down to my blood. There's some aspect to it that matters. I'm not saying there isn't. They do get fed up with having, you know, an Irish family over in America when they have the most American accent going and do nothing but eat pulled pork sandwiches every lunchtime. What I'm saying is they are clearly, in a very civic sense, very American. The Irish don't like hearing that they consider themselves Irish because they don't accept them. Ethnically, what does that make them? Well, as from my definition before, they might self-identify as Irish. The Irish sure as hell don't accept them as Irish. They're not Irish because they're American. Because they also self-identify as American and the Americans accept them. By genetics, sure. There's some Irish in there. Maybe even full Irish. Who knows? It's fine. But at the end of the day, when you've got ethnogenesis over in America and it's to the point there's enough for distinction between this side of the Atlantic, you know, you can't call yourself Scottish, Irish, even some Welsh for some reason. Go on about that. So it's a really interesting subject, ethnicity. And I think if you ever say, oh, all of it follows these particular rules, you're already in the weeds. Because it's such a complex subject. It's all defined by the group. A large part of the culture war, well, even in America, but in Britain especially, it's all about, well, who do we consider British? And an awful lot of that is to do with values. From that alone, I would say the ethnats have absolutely no leg to stand on. But they were the ones that were going absolutely nuts at this. And I can understand why, because Fraser's got a completely idiotic position. And I don't want to be associated with Fraser's position because I think it's idiotic. But at the end of the day, I am largely a civnat. It's just the end of it.
I mean, they don't know the first thing about Czech Republic. I mean, they know everything about England because they were born here. This is they cheer for England's football teams now. It took them a while, but they do. Interesting
point there. I'm wondering why it took them a while. I would imagine it's because they're Scottish. Why? Well, because their dad's Scottish. I would generally think that, but while they cheer for England's team now, they passed the Tebbit test. What's the Tebbit test? Well, Norman Tebbit was a Conservative MP who basically made the point that a good way you can tell if someone's integrated is if they support the English cricket team. If they support the Pakistani cricket team, they're probably self-identifying as Pakistani because, well, they see Pakistan as representing them at cricket. And largely, everyone agreed with it. But it's not become popular because it's kind of a knockout punch to the types of Fraser Nelsons that are out there saying, oh, it only matters if you're born here. Well, do they support England? No. Well, are they English then? Probably not.
So that's the way I see nationality.
There's another self-report there. Ethnicity, again, it's a large and complicated subject. It can refer to a national group, a countrywide group, sure. However, Britain's the nation state. That is the nation. Sorry, the United Kingdom's the nation. Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, of course, they're all countries. Are they nations? Well, yeah, kind of. Okay, you go even further down into there. Are Scousers an ethnic group? Yeah, kinda. They definitely have a specific genetic component. There's a lot of Irish there. They have a shared culture. Generally, they have a shared history. There's a reason that the meme goes around of like, oh, Brits talking about a town 20 miles down the road. It's, calling them savages and barely even human. There's clearly sub-ethnicities there. Think of... it's a funny example to bring up, to be honest, but think of Kemi Badenoch constantly bringing up Nigeria and how she doesn't see herself as ethnically the same as, half of Nigeria. It's a funny old thing, ethnicity. Is Kemi Badenoch English? It's a tough one. She keeps talking about Nigeria. It's definitely a problem with anywhere people. They are kind of the best at having their ethnicity and eating it too, I would say. A massive problem Kemi Badenoch has, though, is that, are you shown as integrated to marry someone of that particular nation? Yeah, I would say so. It takes quite a lot to, make vows and spend the rest of your life with someone. So she did it with an Englishman. Is she English? Well, by that level, yeah, sure. But, is that another definition to being English ethnically? Yeah, probably. It's a tough one. And so, this is where it all comes down to. Really, we're saying who deserves to be and stay in the country and who doesn't. Well, I think it's fair to say if you've married a native, yeah, fair enough, you can stay. It's fine. Because you can't force people to divorce and then kick one half out of the country, especially if they've got kids. That's just absurd. Now, can you call the person who married them English? Well, you can't call Kemi Badenoch English via genetics, because she's Nigerian. Can you call her English by her values and habits? Kind of, I guess. It's a tough one. And finding where the bar is where we're all having issues. But clearly, my bar is somewhere above Humza Yousaf, somewhere around Kemi Badenoch, and obviously, Fraser Nelson's kids are above it. It'd be an interesting question. Kemi Badenoch, who would you support in a football match between England and Nigeria? Don't know what her answer is, but it'd give us a good indication of whether she's integrated or not. And these might be uncomfortable questions for an awful lot of people. Well, we're at the point where we have to start addressing them, because if you don't, people are just going to go along with the people that actually have a fixed view on what this all is. Even if they find it a little bit uncouth, they'll just go with it, because the argument of, well, going the other way caused all these problems. Do you really want to keep going down that route? That's going to win. So you're actually going to need something that is completely different to the ideas we've had for the past 20 years of what the elites think an English person or a Brit is. Luckily, I have a different idea to that, so I'm safe.
Now, I know that not everybody does that. Now, again,
most people don't. The overwhelming majority of people don't see nationality in every country in the world.
Every country in the world is pretty irrelevant to the conversation, to be honest. We're asking, what do the Brits think British is? What do the English think English is? That's all that really matters here. Basically, nowhere in the world, and you could maybe argue America, believes in the idea of anchor babies. You tell people that being born here makes you English, everyone will think you're ridiculous. They'll use the old, if I was born in a stable, that doesn't make me a horse. It's fair enough. But making this an international argument, I think you need to get away from that. It's largely irrelevant to what English people deem as English people.
But I'm giving you my answer.
Yeah,
and I think that take, for example, my wife. Now, she was born to refugee parents. They fled the Soviets, and she brought up in Sweden, but she never felt Swedish because she felt that the word Swedish, the way that people used it, did have an ethnic undertone. If you looked a little bit dusky, right? If you look a little bit foreign, then you would not be seen to be Swedish.
Yeah, this is why the international argument just doesn't matter. Like, oh, the Swedish have a larger ethnic undertone than the English. Doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter at all. It's a complete waste of the argument, frankly.
Right, now, it's very strange because I don't look at her and see somebody who looks a bit foreign.
Frankly, probably because she's white.
but only if you see it from the Swede's eyes. You might look at you for it, you might struggle to patch yourself off as a Swede. I don't know. It's not something I don't think we really spend much time in this country looking at somebody. Look at Konstantin, right? Is he? You know, I don't know. You might guess, but it wouldn't be that much that important.
He's babbling a bit because he's a bit uncomfortable by the conversation, because I basically think he knows that he's trapped it, even though Konstantin didn't. I don't think he did that good a job of arguing against his points. You know, he did all right, but he's babbling here. But largely, I think, because he's uncomfortable, and you know, he's uncomfortable with the idea of there being an ethnic component to the British identity, because he's worried it leads you down a road to basically legitimising racism. But I kind of hate to say it, like, racism is just applied in-group, out-group, you know, instincts, frankly. There is some use to the in-group, out-group application. When it comes to Shamima Begum, is it racist to take away her British citizenship? Yeah, maybe. To be honest with you. Is that bad? No. She was a terrorist. And we'll get into this point at the end. It's like, what's wrong with racism? Well, a very, very small amount of it might not be a bad idea, but it's got to be minuscule, and we have got to keep that battened down, because racism does not take you to good places, as the mid-century Germans showed us. It's fine to have that worry, doesn't mean you need to stamp out all racism ever. You know, as I say, the Shamima Begum argument, what's the difference between her and Jihadi John? Well, again though, it's a definition of racism. Is it racism? Well, was it because of her race? No. It was because she had Bangladeshi citizenship. You know, could you say that's derived from racism? If you really want to push it, yeah. You know, if that's the amount we have that maybe you could call that racism, fine. But if that's as far as it goes, really there shouldn't be a problem. But this is the problem. Fraser Nelson doesn't want that at all. But it's taking him to such much worse, frankly, philosophical outcomes that, frankly, you're probably just going to have to cede some ground on this. You're going to give way too much ground to the other side otherwise.
Here, she does not feel like an alien. Now, perhaps she is because she's an immigrant. But weirdly, she felt more of an alien in Sweden, where she was born. Sense to me, but she does here.
Because we have, as I said, an overarching identity. It's the same in America. It's actually to a lesser extent, but very similar in Russia, where, you know, Armenians can be Russian if they're, but Russian in an overarching sense. No one would think they're ethnically Russian.
Yeah, and I don't, you know, this video's over an hour long. I don't want to get too into it, but I think Konstantin did a reply to Callum, effectively explaining that, well, in Russia there are two types of Russian: ethnic Russians, so, you know, the proper Slavs, genetics, whatever, and there's also the Russian citizen. It's the same here, and frankly, I know people don't like to hear it, but it's kind of the same with the English as well, frankly. You know, we invited over the King George I from Hanover. The deal was there, right, okay, you're like 30, you're not going to integrate. Your sons will be English, though. And they integrated. By the time he got to George III, King of England, people generally saw him as English. We clearly have some sort of tradition that we, frankly, accept that integration is somewhat possible. To be honest with you, it kind of makes sense. Anglos and Saxons were different ethnic groups. Our ethnogenesis was a mixture of those groups. So it's kind of no duh that we have a history of letting Huguenots in. Oh, look, they become part of the larger ethnic group. It's happened with some Jewish communities as well. A lot of Scots migrated down as well. They've become English. It's, you know, clearly we have some understanding of genetic mixing just being kind of part and parcel of being a country, really. Especially one where we're an island and we've been, you know, we've been a place for refugees before. The thing is that it was a few thousand over the course of, you know, 200 years or something like that. The problem is that we have a few 100,000 coming over in about 20 days. The rate and scale are a massive issue, and it's made people see, oh, look, there is a difference here. Oh my God, they've got massive. Whereas before it was like, oh, you know, Frank's wife, he's a bit different. You know, he's a bit different. She's a bit different. Oh, she's a Huguenot? Oh, all right. Oh, well, their kids are English. That's good enough. Oh, she speaks English. She joins in with us. Okay, we'll welcome her to, you know, the Harvest Festival or whatever, and they integrate. Scale, speed, rate, all of this stuff, it all obviously matters. And it all plays into the integration. And we'll get into specifically what integration is soon.
Right. The point I'm trying to make to you is, a country is what a country is. And when that country changes over time in a way that's both visually and culturally different, that is a discombobulating thing for the vast majority of the people who live in that place.
Yeah, he's absolutely nailed it. It's the rate that it has happened. We have been a country where other ethnic groups have come over very slowly and they've managed to integrate. They've come over too quickly now, where we have colonies everywhere. Massive issue people want dealt with. Can't deal with it though because racism. You know, it's the classic what would Hitler not do. That's generally just people's philosophy these days. Not what would Jesus do, not a positive vision of we need to strive to this. It's we need to get as far away from that as possible, and it's bringing you to ridiculous conclusions of, yeah, if you're born here, that'll do. No, nobody agrees with that. Nobody's agreed with that in history. Barely anyone agrees with it today apart from the liberal elite. You're screwed. You don't have a chance. It's no wonder it's no wonder we're in the middle of a culture war.
Maybe not for you, maybe not for lots of people in the media, maybe not for lots of people in the building across the road and in the parliament, but for the vast majority of people in this country, their sense is that when the country ceases to be visually the same as it was at some point, there is a level when it ceases to be that country.
Again, rate and scale really matter here. I mean, I've been asked a few times, oh, if Britain was 100% black, but still culturally English, would I be fine? And I always say, yeah, in theory. The thing is, in reality, one, that's probably never going to happen, but if it were to happen, it'd have to take like 3,000 years. It'd have to be ages. Why? Because the generations have to see slow incremental changes in the visual representation of it. You know, you go back to Cheddar Man. Cheddar Man was obviously not sub-Saharan African black. However, he probably had some sort of olive skin. He probably didn't look, you know, pale white like a lot of English people do these days. And yet what happens? They find an ancestor of Cheddar Man literally down the road from where he was found. His face looks largely the same shape and structure. However, the skin colour probably would have been different. Why? Because over time, you know, when you're in England, it rains all the time, there's less sunlight, you need less melanin to protect you from the UV rays, you end up white. It's fine. So for that to happen in reverse, either there has to be some massive tectonic movement that moves us close to the equator and we naturally get black over time, or if a load of Africans come over, frankly, over the next like 3,000 years, they integrate, you know, I say a load of Africans, again, the rate and scale, you know, it'd have to be millions over, as I say, like 3,000 years or something like that, which is an awfully long time. And if they integrate to that extent, in theory, then as far as I'm concerned, they're still English because they've integrated. What does that mean? We'll get into it. But it basically means indistinguishable from the English. And it does seem awfully radical and awfully purely civnat, but at the end of the day, part of integration is interbreeding. But if the interbreeding and intermarriage moves us over more to dark skin, it's like, do I have a problem with that? Well, you know, a big thing with Britain is individual choice. If this is individual choice of the English and they all consider each other English, where do you go with that? You know? As I say, what's a Huguenot? Doesn't exist. Because they've so integrated with the English, they're indistinguishable. What are they? Don't know. People call Nigel Farage a Huguenot. Everyone thinks the libs are weird for saying that.
Well, the countries always change. You had the Gael, the Pict, the Saxon, the Dane. I mean, you have got patterns of the...
Yeah, this is where the massive issue comes in. Yeah, as I say, we do have a history of some integration. The problem is, as I say, the scale was much less over a much longer time period. That allowed for decent integration. We don't have that now. You can't just say, yeah, we used to have Picts and Danes came over, you know, Anglos and Saxons intermixed. You can't say that and then think, yeah, all these Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, whatever, they all come over. Yeah, they'll just naturally come into the melting pot. It's like, no, they won't. Why? Because back in the 60s, people were telling government to stop it. Why were they saying that? Because they don't feel like they were coming into the melting pot. And then you have a big issue. If the English generally don't think that's happening, and they voted for centuries for the immigration to stop, you better stop it because clearly the integration isn't happening and people feel like they're going to be aliens in their own country, as a lot of them do now. It's absolutely true, and it's true on a civic sense, but the problem is that civic nationalism is exemplified in people like Fraser Nelson, and they're idiots. And they are obviously going to bring us to a place that is going to destroy the country as we know it, and I don't want that. But you can obviously make civic arguments against it, as a lot of civic nationalists do. And also these types of civic nationalists understand that there's, you know, genetic components to all this as well when you get to certain cases. And that's fine. It's absolutely fine. There's always naturally going to be that level of it. There's always going to be people who value genetics above everything else as well. They're part of the English stock. You just have to deal with that.
By the way, I don't want for a second to seem to be disparaging or diminish people who feel that way. These are hugely important, and I think we make a grave mistake if we say, oh, they're all racist, so let's not talk about it.
That's where the clip ends, and at least he understands he needs to address the arguments being made. But as I say, he doesn't do a very good job of it, and Konstantin Kisin does okay with it. However, this video is probably going to be an hour and a half, but whatever. I want to make it very clear what my views are on British values, integration and immigration. So obviously, I am happy with Reform's immigration plan. Deport all foreign criminals, deport all illegal aliens, obviously bring immigration down to net zero. You know, that either means it's going to be absolute zero or you're going to have net emigration. Like, that's fine. That's fine for the next 5 years. You know, we've had such a massive wave, you're not going to get rid of them all overnight. You know, this is probably going to be a 10, 20, maybe even 30-year project. Clearly, that is a good first step. But on terms of British values, I largely just agree with George Orwell, who, despite being English and British as he considered himself, he was still a little bit of an outsider when it came to native Britain, because he grew up in India, in a colony, sure, and so he'd only ever heard stories of England and not had any first-hand experience. However, during the war, he wrote a pamphlet called England, Your England, and he ends with this paragraph. This war, unless we are defeated, will wipe out most of the existing class privilege. There are every day fewer people who wish to continue, nor need we fear that as the pattern changes, life in England will lose its peculiar flavour. The new red cities of Greater London are crude enough, but these things are only the rash that accompanies the changes. In whatever shape England emerges from the war, it will be deeply tinged with the characteristics that I have spoken of earlier. The intellectuals who hope to see it Russian or Germanised will be disappointed. The gentleness, the hypocrisy, the thoughtlessness, the reverence for law, and the hatred of uniforms will long remain, along with suet puddings and the misty skies. It needs some very great disaster, such as prolonged subjugation by a foreign enemy, to destroy a national culture. The stock exchange will be pulled down, the horseplough will give way to the tractor, the country houses will be turned into children's holiday camps, the Eton and Harrow match will be forgotten, but England will still be England. An everlasting animal stretching into the future and the past, and like all living things, having the power to change out of recognition and yet remain the same. Now you might be asking, what the hell does all that mean? Well, effectively, the entire pamphlet, England, Your England, was effectively George Orwell trying to rationalise what Englishness actually was, in terms of its values. And he rarely brings up any sort of genetic component, but he does understand that, well, to stretch all the way to the past and have completely different values back 100 years before this was written, 100 years before that, the values were largely seemed quite different. However, it was still England, and yet, despite the fact that Victorian London was quite unrecognisable to Georgian London, which was quite unrecognisable to Tudor London, still it kind of remains the same. And the English can almost put themselves in these situations and understand why their values were quite different if they really thought about it, and that is his point. As long as England still has the English, then things will remain the same, yet the values will change. And this is the point I'm making at the moment. A lot of people, especially on the ethno-nat side, are kind of saying British values don't matter. They're like, oh, they're fleeting, they change all the time. Yeah, it's true. The thing is that what's the point of the culture war? Well, it's to enact and have as the general zeitgeist the British values that we are pushing. Now, in my way, it's a kind of Anglo-futurism with Victorian attitudes. And largely that's what Margaret Thatcher wanted back. You know, they had another culture war pretty much throughout the 70s because there was barely any good going on at that time. The country was at a standstill, etc., etc. Margaret Thatcher comes in, improves everything. Everyone sees the 90s and noughties as the best time ever because of a result of her policies. And we're looking for that to come about again. You know, the best chance is probably via route of reform. Hence, they're very, very popular. And reform, largely, I don't think Nigel Farage would say being born here makes you English. I think it'd be ridiculous for him to say that. However, at the same time, he clearly sees Zaya Yusuf, despite being born in Sri Lanka, as an integrated Englishman. He clearly sees that. I'm actually wrong about that. He was born to Sri Lankan parents, but he was born in Scotland. but spent most of his life in England and blah 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 blah. You get the idea. Clearly, Reform do believe to some extent in integration, and Britain throughout time has pretty much always seen integration as largely a possible thing. As I say, Disraeli was seen as an Englishman by the English. Why wouldn't you say he's English? Oh, because of his Jewish DNA. Well, good luck arguing against the Brits with that. But I want to get on to another a hero, I suppose you could say, of mine, which is Enoch Powell. And this is going to get on to the point of integration. So here's an extract from his Birmingham speech in 1968. Yes, the Rivers of Blood one. The other dangerous delusion from which those who are willfully or otherwise blind to reality suffer is summed up in the word integration. To be integrated into a population means to become, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from its other members. Now, at all times where there are marked physical differences, especially of colour, integration is difficult, though over a period not impossible. There are among the Commonwealth immigrants who have come to live here in the last 15 years or so, many thousands whose wish and purpose is to be integrated and whose every thought and endeavour is bent in that direction. But to imagine that such a thing enters the heads of a great and growing majority of immigrants and their descendants is a ludicrous misconception and a dangerous one. And I agree with absolutely every word of Enoch Powell here. Enoch Powell, it's here in writing, he said it to a speech to hundreds of people that obviously a vast amount of English people, well, British people, frankly, clearly agreed with, hence all of the letters he got written to him, hence he's seen as one of the best British statesmen of the 20th century. They clearly agree with this. They clearly agree, yes, integration is possible. Yes, it probably is more difficult for people with a different colour than me to integrate, but it is clearly possible over a period of time, and clearly there are people that, probably these people knew individually, who made it their purpose to integrate when they moved to Britain, and they don't largely have a problem with it. However, as he points out, an awful lot of people didn't bother and were making enclaves even back in the 60s. And that is the problem people had. This is part of the reason there was a massive vote to, well, stop immigration. Maybe not stop, but severely limit it. And there's been appetite for that for, probably a century. Maybe less than a century because this was more a post-war thing, however. Clearly, I just want to make it clear, I agree with Enoch Powell on pretty much every point he had on immigration. And this integration part, I want to make it clear. Clearly, Enoch Powell believed you could be black and British. And in fact, he even says that even in his last interview.
I was one of those wide-eyed, grinning pickaninnies that he saw fit to quote in a letter, and that was hurtful, of course. For the first time in the country of my birth, and the country of which I'm proud to say I belong, I was shouted at and spat at and abused in the streets for the first time ever the day after that. So, of course, I remember it.
Yeah, this is quite a famous clip from one of Enoch Powell's. It's kind of a mini documentary done in his life, obviously after he got Parkinson's. But as the guy says, he said he was proud to be part of England, or Britain, I don't know which word he'd particularly use. He is proud to call himself, the country of his birth, British and English. What does Enoch Powell say to this?
I take it as true since he says so. I accept it as truth.
So he's taking Paul Boateng at his word that he sees himself as English-British, whichever word he'd used there, and that he did suffer racism from what he would call his countrymen around that time, which had never happened before, largely because, yeah, he was seen as integrated and it was seen as, well, uncouth to not consider black people to be integrated. But clearly, as I say, there's always been a cohort of people who won't accept that. And I know that. Fine. But frankly, they're probably always going to be a minority. Even through this period of history, they'll probably become more popular than they were, sure. However, it's just got to a point where too many people know too many individuals who have been well integrated and will call themselves British, and they'd call, their friend. You're just not going to convince people that it's impossible for black people to integrate, for example. It's over. You're not going to win that argument, I'm afraid. Does that mean that you need mass migration and that it should be accepted that millions of people come in every year? No, obviously not, and people don't agree with that. How do I know? Reform are winning in the polls, my dude.
But it only revealed the underlying tensions.
This is true as well, and the problem is that an awful lot of people who will have spat at Paul here in the street, it probably will have been, avowed racist, and they wouldn't have hid it. However, most people would probably think, oh no, I agree with this integration part of the speech. He is integrated. Hell, a lot of those people probably, well, maybe not a lot, but a few of those people maybe even voted for him. And likely a lot of people will have heard these stories and thought, that's really not good. That's, not what I wanted. These people don't represent me. And all Enoch Powell's saying is, well, I said these words, there are underlying tensions. Sure, they came out thinking this was now acceptable, but how can you hold me responsible for what other people do with the misunderstanding of my statements, words and speeches? Which I think is a fair point.
But can you see that the language that you quoted in your speech was itself inflammatory and could be used by people who were racialists against black people in this country?
What's wrong with racism? Racism is the basis of nationality. It's the basis of his nationality.
Again, it's quite an issue with language here. Back in, back last century, there was actually quite a difference between racist and racialist. A racist was more seen as what is a Monday xenophobe. A racialist was more seen as a Monday racist. The Monday racist, the racialist, that's all about skin colour. The racist or xenophobe, that's more about different country, ethnicity, whatever. Enoch Powell's point here, as I said before, is all about, well, we all have in-group, out-group preferences. Sometimes that is applied on the basis of sometimes skin colour. A lot of the times your ethnic group, whether that's your nationality or whatever. What's wrong with that? He bases his nationality on that as well, in that, yes, some people are of my nation, some people aren't. Some people are of my race, some people aren't. Now, he probably gives preferential treatment to the people of his own ethnicity. As he said, he considers himself part of the English or British, and probably gives preferential treatment to those types of people. And that's all Enoch Powell's saying there. What's wrong with in-group, out-group preferences? Nothing. Okay, what's wrong if it's applied to race? Well, Hitler. Which is like, well, yeah, but any in-group or out-group preference can go too far. Why is one that is based on ethnicity seen as so bad?
He says he's black, but he's British, and he feels British. What is his nationality?
His nationality is the nationality he feels is the nation he'll fight for or play cricket for.
I mean, again, it's just a bit like the Civic test. Yeah, what country would you fight for? What country would you represent? Well, clearly, you feel a part of that country. It's quite a blatant way, especially the war example. It's a blatant way to show where your allegiances are. And this is why it's a bit difficult to, in my mind, defend dual nationals. As I said before, Kemi Badenoch, would you support Nigeria or England when it came to any sort of football match between them? And God knows what she'd answer, but it shows where her allegiances are. And this is where the Norman Tebbit test comes from. Enoch Powell at the end of the day was just using that, but using it for different applications. Would you play cricket for England? Well, then you're English. Would you fight for England? Well, then you're English. I don't think it's a bad test, and I think it's one that practically everyone can agree with. Why would you say no to that type of support in a war? It's the whole idea of where service guarantees citizenship comes from. It's, universally, it just seems like a good rule of thumb.
But are you saying that because he's black, he can't have British nationality?
It's not impossible, it's difficult.
There you go. It's difficult. You can be black British, but it is difficult. And as he says, if he feels like he'll fight for Britain, he's British. If he feels like he'll play on the English cricket team, he's English. Again, decent rule of thumb. I don't see the issue with it. If people can lie, yeah, they can lie in hypotheticals, fine. I agree with that. Let's go to war then. However, people generally, if the cricket or some sort of sport's on, they'll show their allegiances generally. You can just do that. I know people are like, I'm not saying, as part of the citizenship test, ask them which country would you support. That's obviously going to be a bit of a self-report of, yeah, they're just going to lie in that, obviously. There's got to be evidence of whenever these people are watching cricket, you see which side they're clearly supporting. They'll give it away if they don't, if they don't think anything's going to come of it. But that's the problem. As soon as you make it the basis for a test, they'll all lie. I understand the issue there.
But when you said that racism is the basis of his nationality, what did you mean by that?
Nations are, upon the whole, united by identity with one another, the self-identification of our citizens, and that's normally due to similarities which we regard as racial similarities.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that last bit in there to make it quite clear. They are deemed as racial similarities. To the Brits, it's a rather large civic code, frankly. That's largely where it comes down to. If you have two people who break those civic codes to the same extent, they'll go down to, you know, your genetics. It's fine. It's how we work. It's how we've pretty much always worked. And it's what my view on the situation is. Now, leftists have tried to subvert that by saying, well, if, you know, we focus so much on the civil part of it, why not make it all civil? And then you end up sounding like an idiot like Fraser Nelson. This obviously needs to be rejected. It's fine. But ethno-nats then go too far the other way and say, well, you know, clearly this civil stuff is being easily subverted. Let's do something that's impossible to subvert. And then as my point is, well, that's going completely against what England actually meant as what England and Britain actually means to the people who self-identify as such. So no, it's not particularly going to work. You can try your best to try and convince people and get there democratically, but you know, why did the BNP collapse? Oh, because clearly they were too ethno-nationalist and people didn't like it. Why has there been no large-scale ethno-nationalist movement since? People don't like it. Simple as that. It's over. I've always said the best thing for them to do is just to try and join the most anti-immigrant civic nationalist movement that they can, but they'd rather just be pure with their own values, ironically enough. So fine with me. But I just wanted to go through this because I think I think Fraser Nelson is one of those people that can be convinced otherwise. I just don't think the arguments being put forward to him are particularly good and getting him to kind of think in the right way. You need to use real world examples for this sort of thing. This is why the hypothetical thing isn't too great, and I admit, because people can lie about these things. But if he ever says where you're born is what matters, you know, they tried to use the Japan example and he couldn't answer it. Because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what Japan think. We're talking about what the British people think. So, okay, George Orwell. Is he Indian? No, he's British. Why? Well, because he was born and raised in India, sure, but he was born and raised in an, you know, British enclave. Oh, interesting. People born in Britain who grow up in enclaves, what about them? That's where you'd get him to struggle, and that's what you have to ask him. But, Konstantin Kisin, I don't think he's fully developed his thoughts on this side of things yet, but he's pretty close to it. I largely agreed with what he had to say. I just don't think he was making particularly good arguments. But either way, I've nearly made this video an hour and a half, so I think that's enough of that. But I can talk about this for hours, as you can tell. I really like the subject. I think it's really complex and really interesting to weave through, and I think if you try and simplify it to either fully civic nationalist or ethno-nationalist, you're in the wrong plane of being, really. Your thought process is going to just be mental. Anyway, as I say, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. So, obviously there wasn't a stream 2 days ago on Monday. There's no stream tonight either, so I just lied in Monday's video. Don't worry about that. Instead, Thursday is going to be the Tosh Talks. We're talking about the birthright question, which, ironically, just that I've said I love talking about ethnicity, I really couldn't care less about birthrights. I think they're a red herring. But the panel has things to say on it, so we will go through it. So that is tomorrow on the Worcester Club at 9 PM. Obviously, there's no other stream this week. Might do a gaming one, don't know. I enjoy the shooting the breeze while playing some games, so you might get lucky with that. People seem to enjoy the conversations as well. As for how you can help out the channel, do leave a comment, let me know what you think, because this is such a complex weave of ideas that there's bound to be, obviously, I know there are people in my audience who are going to disagree with me, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. Where do you think I'm wrong? Where do you agree with me? Have I made you think differently about anything in particular? Don't know. I'd love to find out. Do leave a like as well, and obviously subscribe. They are quick, free and easy ways to help me out. If you think I deserve a little bit more, you can always leave a super chat or super thanks on any video or stream that I do, or become a member from £2 a month. You get full access to all of my previous Laughing at the Guardians with some women, so do look forward to that. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.